Ella's whole world, or the most interesting part of it anyway, was framed by the dusty sash of her kitchen window. This wasn't a fancy picture window, mind you, just an old, warped pane of glass set above a sink that had seen more grease and coffee grounds than the Mississippi Delta. Every morning, sharp at 6:15, Ella would start her coffee, not instant stuff, but the slow, methodical kind that bloomed in the filter, filling her small house with a promise of strength. And every morning, when she turned to face the sink, there he was, the man across the street. His name was Joe, though Ella had never spoken a word to him. She knew only his routine, a predictable, comforting rhythm in a world that often felt erratic. Joe lived in the pale yellow house, the one with the porch swing that never swung. He was a man built mostly of silence and habit, and his morning ritual was her private, unacknowledged sunrise. He'd sit at his small, square kitchen table, always facing the street, and eat. He wasn't a man for scrambled eggs or grits, which always struck Ella as peculiar for someone living this far south. No, Joe ate the same thing every single day without fail, and it was a peculiar plate of oatmeal, but not the sugary kind. It was plain, thick, and topped with exactly 3 sliced strawberries. Ella had timed him. 6 minutes and 42 seconds, start to finish. He never looked at a phone, never read a newspaper, and never seemed to look out the window. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, maybe at the wall, maybe at his own reflection in the window glass, but never once, in the 2 years Ella had been watching, had he turned his head towards her house. This absolute dedication to a simple, unvarying ritual was the anchor of Ella's morning. It was a secret she kept, a little pocket of stolen order she could rely on, more so than the weather or the mailman. She often wondered what kind of life led a man to find such perfection in 3 strawberries and 6 minutes of silence. It was the kind of thought that only came to you when you were alone and waiting for the world to start up proper. The kitchen window was more than just a pane of glass. It was a theater stage built just for one actor. Ella wasn't being nosy, not exactly. She called it observational research. In her mind, Joe was a character in a book she hadn't yet been given the words to write. He wore the same muted gray sweater, even in the humid late spring mornings. He had neat, dark hair that looked freshly cut every Monday morning, a detail that spoke volumes to Ella about his inner discipline. She found herself imagining stories for him. Was he a retired accountant? A heartbroken poet? She decided he was a man who had once been burned by spontaneity and had chosen routine as a form of armor. She imagined the silence in his house was not empty, but heavy with unsaid memories, and the rhythmic clink of his spoon against the bowl was his way of keeping time against the clock of regret. She knew it was probably foolish, inventing a whole history for a stranger, but it made her coffee taste better, giving a little narrative sparkle to her otherwise quiet life in this dusty corner of Georgia. One Tuesday, the sun was just cresting over the old pecan tree in the yard, the one that housed the loudest blue jays in the county, and Ella was already on her second cup. 6:15 came and went. Ella wiped a smudge of steam from the glass and waited. 6:20. The blue jay squawked, but Joe didn't appear. Ella felt a slight, cold pressure in her chest, the kind of irrational worry reserved for beloved pets or distant kin. Maybe he was just running late. Maybe he slept in. She told herself it was nothing, just a minor deviation in an otherwise perfect pattern. But the feeling of unease persisted. It was like a chord had been struck wrong in a perfectly tuned piano. The absence of the gray sweater and the bowl of plain, 3 strawberry oatmeal left a physical hole in the landscape of her morning. She kept glancing at the yellow house, half expecting the ghost of his routine to materialize, but the kitchen window across the way remained a dark, reflective square, offering only the blank face of its own secrecy. Ella tried to busy herself, scrubbing the porcelain sink basin with a little more elbow grease than necessary, the friction serving as a distraction. She even called her sister, Maggie, up north, just to hear a voice that wasn't her own internal monologue. But the conversation felt flimsy, thin like cheap cloth, because the real drama, the missing breakfast, was happening just 50 feet away and couldn't be spoken of. How do you explain to another soul that the absence of a stranger eating oatmeal is fundamentally upsetting your equilibrium? They'd think she was finally cracking up, succumbing to the solitude of the south-facing porch. She hung up on Maggie mid-sentence, claiming a sudden need to check the mailbox. Standing on her own porch, the thick morning air smelling of dew and cut grass, she peered down the street. No strange cars, no ambulances, nothing out of the ordinary. The yellow house looked exactly as it always did, utterly, impenetrably silent. 6:40. Past time. The 6 minutes and 42 seconds had stretched into 25 minutes of gnawing curiosity. Ella finally admitted to herself that this was more than just a break in routine. It was a true disruption. She felt a sting of guilt, recognizing the sheer dependency she had placed on this man she didn't know. He was her private clock tower, her silent assurance that the world was still spinning on its proper axis. Now the clock had stopped. She walked back inside, the floorboards sighing under her slippers, and the kitchen felt suddenly colder, emptier. She considered calling the non-emergency police line, but what would she say? A gentleman I spy on every morning hasn't eaten his breakfast. That sounded like the first line of a commitment paper. No, she had to wait. She would give him the day. A full, slow southern day, where the shadows move like molasses, to account for his absence. The day dragged, thick and heavy. Every time Ella walked past the kitchen, which was often, she caught herself staring. She didn't see a light on that night, either, which was another deviation. Joe always left one small lamp on in the living room, a soft, honey-colored glow that fought the deep southern dark. Now the house was just a black silhouette against the moon. The next morning, Wednesday, Ella was at the window at 6 sharp, her own breakfast ignored, the coffee already bitter in the pot. She watched the yellow house with a desperation that was new and alarming. Nothing. No movement, no gray sweater, no rhythmic clink. The porch swing hung motionless, a silent judge. That day, she took a walk, a purposeful, meandering route that led her directly past his mailbox. It was overflowing. Not just one day's worth, but 2. The junk mail was already bowing under the damp humidity. Seeing the untouched mailbox was the first real, physical piece of evidence that something was genuinely wrong. Mail is sacred, especially in a small town. You don't leave it to bloat in the rain. This wasn't a man who overslept. This was a man who was away. But where? And why the sudden, clean break from a routine that was practically inscribed in stone? Ella felt a thrill of fear mingled with a perverse sense of relief. Her intuition hadn't been wrong. This was a mystery, not a delusion. She debated knocking on the door, but the idea felt invasive, a crossing of a line that had always been clearly marked by the street curb. She pictured his face, the set jaw, the steady focus on his oatmeal, and knew he wouldn't appreciate her involvement. Still, the image of that full mailbox was a silent plea, a signal flare in the quiet morning. She knew she couldn't let it go. She decided to enlist a confidant, a sounding board who wouldn't immediately call the county shrink. Sam, her neighbor 2 doors down, was the closest thing she had to a friend who understood the subtle language of the neighborhood. Sam was a retired mechanic with a gruff exterior and a heart of soft biscuit dough. She found him in his yard, battling a persistent patch of dollar weed. "Sam," she started, keeping her voice low. "Have you seen Joe lately? The fellow in the yellow house." Sam straightened up, wiping his forehead with a grease-stained handkerchief. "Joe? Nah, Ella. Haven't seen his pickup since Tuesday morning. Figured he went down to the coast for some fishing. He does that sometimes. Quick trip, no fuss." Ella's heart sank a little. He does that sometimes. Sam's casual dismissal chipped away at her carefully constructed sense of high drama. Maybe it was just a trip. But why the full mailbox? And why no preparation? "He didn't take his trash out Monday night," Ella mentioned, almost whispering, as if the dollar weed was listening. "Joe's trash can is always curbside Monday, 8 p.m. sharp. Like clockwork." Sam frowned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Is that so? Well now, that ain't like him. Joe's predictable as a tax bill." He looked over at the yellow house, his gaze no longer casual. "You figure he might be sick?" Ella shook her head. If he was sick, he'd be home and the lights would be on. This is too clean. It's like he dissolved. Sam agreed to keep an eye out, but his easy acceptance of a possible fishing trip settled over Ella like a heavy, disappointing blanket. She realized that her intimate knowledge of Joe's tiny habits gave her a sense of impending doom that no one else in the neighborhood shared. To them, he was just a quiet man. To her, he was the missing piece of a complicated puzzle. Thursday came, and the mailbox was still overflowing, a beacon of negligence. Ella decided the neighborly code of conduct was officially suspended. She marched across the street, carrying a small plate of her famous buttermilk biscuits, a flimsy excuse for a wellness check. The air on Joe's porch was noticeably cooler than her own, and the humidity clung to the stagnant air. She knocked. Once, twice, 3 times, each rap sounding loud and intrusive in the morning quiet. Silence. She pressed her ear to the door, a maneuver that felt both necessary and wildly embarrassing. She smelled nothing. No lingering coffee, no cooking oil, no sour smell of neglect. The house was a sealed tomb of absence. She placed the plate of biscuits on the step, a token of her failure, and retreated. As she reached her own curb, she glanced back. She noticed, for the first time, a small detail that chilled her to the bone. The sheer curtains in Joe's kitchen window were slightly, almost imperceptibly, ajar. This was the biggest break from the pattern yet. Joe's curtains were always fully closed by 7 a.m., a final declaration of privacy once his breakfast ritual was complete. They were never ajar. Never. It was such a tiny thing. A fraction of an inch of exposed windowsill, but to Ella it was a screaming sign of something rushed, something unfinished. She spent the entire day consumed by this detail. Did he leave in a hurry? Was someone else in the house after he left? She even dragged her old wooden ladder out of the shed, contemplating a highly undignified ascent just to get a closer look, but her conscience, and the fear of falling and having Sam find her, stopped her. She realized the suspense was no longer about curiosity. It was about the ethical line between passive observation and active interference. Joe had, perhaps unintentionally, extended an invitation by leaving that gap, a tiny tear in the fabric of his secrecy, and Ella felt morally compelled to peek through it. That night, the lack of the honey-colored living room lamp felt oppressive. The dark on Joe's side of the street was deeper, heavier. Ella sat in her own living room, trying to read a paperback, but the words swam before her eyes. She kept hearing the sound of the porch swing, imagining it creaking faintly in the breeze, though she knew it was perfectly still. Around midnight, an idea, cold and daring, settled in her mind. It was a terrible idea, the kind that only seems logical when you are deeply invested in a mystery that isn't yours. She would go over, not to break in but just to check the windows one more time to see if the ajar curtain had changed. She slipped on a pair of soft canvas shoes and, holding her breath, crossed the street under the pale light of the moon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the rhythm loud enough to wake the dead. The gravel crunched slightly under her shoes, a sound that seemed to carry for miles in the dead quiet of the night. As she approached the house, she realized the source of the slight opening in the kitchen curtain was not carelessness, but a tiny, dark object wedged between the curtain and the frame. She crept closer, peering at the object. It was small, metallic, and dull. She reached out a trembling finger and nudged it. It slipped free and fell silently onto the porch floor. She picked it up. It was a house key, old and weighty, tarnished with use, tied to a small, frayed piece of red yarn. Why would Joe wedge his own key in the curtains and leave? This wasn't forgetfulness. It felt deliberate. It felt like a message, or perhaps a clue left by someone else entirely. The key felt heavy and important in her palm, a literal key to the mystery she had been nurturing for 2 years. With the key hot in her hand, Ella retreated quickly back to her own porch, scrambling to unlock her door like a thief. Once inside, under the glare of her weak kitchen light, she examined the key again. It was a standard Schlag key, unremarkable save for the piece of red yarn, the kind you'd tie on a tomato steak. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she couldn't just drop the key back into his full mailbox. The universe, or at least the quiet little corner of the world framed by her kitchen window, had delivered the solution directly into her hands. But the key was useless without a question to ask. Why leave it? She spent the next day, Friday, debating the moral implications of using it. She wasn't investigating a crime. She was just looking for a reason, an explanation for the missing oatmeal and the heavy silence. The inner conflict was intense, a battle between Southern manners and human curiosity. She had to see if the key even worked. That night, she waited until the darkest hour, around 3 in the morning, when the air was cool and the only sound was the distant drone of the interstate. She crossed the street again, the key clutched tightly. It slid into the deadbolt on the yellow house's back door, the one she could see from her window with surprising ease. Clean, smooth click. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Entering felt like crossing a sacred boundary, invading the quiet, disciplined life she had only ever observed from a distance. The lock was no longer the boundary. Her own conscience was. She pushed the door open just enough to confirm it worked, and then, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of self-recrimination, she closed it quietly, leaving the key in the lock, turning it once more to lock the door properly. She retreated, key back in her pocket, the conflict unresolved. She needed more information before she could justify that final step. Saturday morning brought Sam back into the picture. He came over, ostensibly to borrow a wrench, but Ella knew he was there because he was worried. "Still no sign of Joe?" Sam grumbled, stirring the sugar into his coffee. "I walked past. That mailbox is fit to burst, and the grass is already getting shaggy around the edges." Ella carefully mentioned the ajar curtain and the overflowing mailbox, omitting the key detail entirely. "Sam, he wouldn't just leave without telling someone. He's not a flight risk. He's a creature of perfect habit." Sam leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There was a car, Ella. A dark, late-model sedan. It was parked 2 doors down Monday night, real late. Nobody I recognized. Just idling for a long time. A dark sedan." This was the first external, non-Joe-related piece of information. The disruption wasn't internal. It was imposed. The suspicion shifted from Joe being ill to Joe being in trouble. The idea of the dark sedan provided Ella with the moral clarity she needed. Joe might be gone for a tragic reason, and the key might be his silent call for help. Sunday afternoon, emboldened by Sam's sighting and the weight of the key, she recrossed the street. This time, she didn't hesitate. She unlocked the back door and pushed it open, stepping into the dim light of the yellow house. The air inside was stale and cool, but otherwise unremarkable. Everything was neat, almost sterile. The silence, however, was deafening. The kitchen was a perfect mirror of what she saw every day. The small square table, the chair pushed neatly under it, the counter wiped clean. But on the counter, near the sink, was a single, disturbing item. A small, dark red stain on the white linoleum, about the size of a dime. It looked like dried blood. Ella's breath hitched. She stared at the stain, her mind racing. It was too small for a serious injury, perhaps just a clumsy shaving nick, but in this perfectly ordered house, it felt monumental. She walked slowly through the house. The living room was sparsely furnished, a bookshelf, a television, and the chair where the honey-colored lamp usually sat. She found the source of the sudden departure in the small, unused study off the main hall. The room was mostly bare, but resting on the antique writing desk, lit by the shaft of the afternoon sun, was a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It was open to the last page. Next to it was an envelope, addressed simply to Ella, the yellow house. But she lived in the blue house across the street. A mistake? Ella carefully picked up the envelope addressed to Ella, the yellow house. It was sealed, but the dedication suggested that Joe knew of her existence, even if he never acknowledged her across the street. The journal was open. Its final entry dated the morning of his disappearance, Tuesday. She ignored the envelope for a moment, drawn to the journal's final entry, scribbled in a tight, precise hand. It wasn't about danger or fleeing, but about shame and atonement. Joe had written about a massive financial error made decades ago, a debt of honor that had unexpectedly resurfaced, demanded by dark figures, perhaps the occupants of the dark sedan. He hadn't been running from the law. He was running to finally correct a long-buried wrong, a quiet sacrifice that required him to disappear utterly. The note, he wrote, was intended for the new owner of the yellow house, whoever that might be, to explain why the house was suddenly vacant. But then, she saw the crucial detail at the very top of the page, nearly hidden under the spine. It wasn't addressed to Ella. It was addressed to Ellie, a name she hadn't considered. Joe had a secret contact named Ellie, perhaps the owner of the dark sedan, who had come to help him run his errand of atonement. Ella hadn't been a party to his life. She had simply been a witness. She pocketed the key, closed the journal, and, driven by a deep sense of respect, read the letter addressed to Ellie. It was a detailed financial plan and a plea for time. Joe hadn't left a message for his observer across the street. He'd left instructions for his partner in redemption. However, the final, slightly smudged paragraph of the letter contained a single, chilling postscript, handwritten in a different color ink. P.S. If you are not Ellie and you found this key, please know. I chose silence to protect the ones who never knew I watched them. The oatmeal was always my quiet reminder to do better, every 6 minutes. I hope the biscuits were good. J. Ella froze. The key was a message to her. The key wasn't for Ellie. The key was for the person who found it. He knew she watched. He had known all along, perhaps even watched her watching him. The bloodstain was likely just a small cut, but the revelation that her secret had been his secret, and that he had used his disappearance to send her a final, cryptic message, turned the entire dynamic of their 2-year-long silent relationship upside down. Ella left the envelope and journal exactly where she found them, retreating from the house and locking the back door tight. Back in her own kitchen, she felt utterly exposed, yet strangely seen. He had known her name, or at least the fact that she was the woman who watched him from her kitchen. The true conflict wasn't about his disappearance, but about the fragile boundary between two solitary souls. He had lived his life in a predictable cage, and she had used that cage as her own emotional comfort. Now the cage was empty, and the watchman had sent a note to the watcher. The suspense shifted from "Where is he?" to "What did he want me to do with this knowledge?" He had essentially told her, "I am choosing to disappear, and I trust you, the silent observer, to respect that choice." The days bled into a week. Sam was now fully on board with the something is wrong theory, but without the key or the note, he could only speculate wildly about embezzlement or a secret family in another state. Ella kept the key and the postscript a secret, recognizing it as a shared confidence with a man who was now just a memory framed in her window. She felt the heavy burden of his self-imposed silence. She had to honor his desire for atonement and disappearance. The yellow house across the way began to deteriorate almost instantly, the yard becoming overgrown, the paint looking duller, the porch swing slowly collecting dust. It felt like Joe had sucked the life and order right out of the building when he walked out that door. The absence was no longer a temporary disruption. It was becoming a permanent fixture in the neighborhood landscape. Ella realized she was grieving the loss of her routine, the loss of her character in the book she was writing. Her own coffee ritual felt meaningless without his opposing ritual. She tried a new breakfast, a peach cobbler, but it tasted like ash. She walked to the window, the sun streaming through the dust motes, and saw only the dark, reflective glass of Joe's kitchen. She picked up the key he had left, tracing the edge of the frayed red yarn. It was a simple key, but it represented the complexity of human connection built on nothing but sightlines. She decided to use the key one last time, not to investigate, but to bring closure and perhaps to pay her respects to the empty stage. She crossed the street late that afternoon, the air thick and quiet. She unlocked the back door, and this time, instead of feeling like an intruder, she felt like a caretaker. She walked into the living room and retrieved the honey-colored lamp. She plugged it in, turned it on, and placed it back on the side table. The soft, familiar glow immediately cut into the gloom of the house, a small beacon against the gathering dusk. She was restoring the one small detail that symbolized Joe's presence against the dark. She then went to the kitchen, fetched a bucket and a cloth, and gently scrubbed away the small, dark red stain on the linoleum. It disappeared easily, confirming it was just a minor scrape, a final, mundane accident. She was erasing the last visible trace of his physical presence. Ella found a large, sturdy manila envelope in Joe's desk and carefully sealed the worn leather journal inside. She wasn't destroying it or moving it far, just preserving his story. She then took the small square table from the kitchen and moved it into the living room. She placed the key on the table, tying the frayed red yarn around the lamp's pull chain as a final marker. Now, anyone who came into the house would find the truth laid out quietly. The honey-colored lamp left on, the journal secured, and the key where it could be found. She had done what she felt he had tacitly asked, to respect his decision, to close the chapter, and to leave a light on for his return, however unlikely. As she stepped back out and locked the door for the final time, the single golden light glowing in Joe's living room felt like a hug. She stood on the porch, inhaling the heavy scent of jasmine that only bloomed properly at night, and she felt the deep, satisfying relief of having chosen empathy over curiosity. She walked back across the street, the yellow house now appearing less like a mystery and more like a sleeping friend. The window across the way was still a dark mirror, but the darkness was now pierced by the soft, human-made light. The routine was broken, but something deeper, a quiet covenant between two strangers, had been forged and fulfilled. The next morning, Monday, Ella woke up early, but she didn't rush to the window. She took her time with her coffee, letting it bloom perfectly, filling her house with that specific, comforting aroma. When she finally walked to the sink, she didn't look across the street immediately. She looked at her own reflection in her own pane of glass, a woman older now, changed by the shared secret of a stranger's routine. When she finally looked up, she saw the honey-colored light still glowing across the street, a permanent memorial to a life of quiet discipline and sudden, necessary flight. The yellow house remained empty, but it no longer felt silent, felt like it was holding its breath. Ella decided to start her own routine again, but this time it would be different. She made her coffee and she sat down at her own kitchen table, facing her own window. Instead of watching Joe, she started writing in a small, cheap notebook she had bought. Not about Joe, but about herself. About the things she had been afraid to do, the spontaneous trips she had always deferred. Joe's disappearance had acted as a final, dramatic nudge, reminding her that life's most profound departures are often silent. She wrote about her desire to see the coast, the one Sam had mentioned. She wrote about the 6 minutes and 42 seconds of oatmeal, and the quiet dignity of a man who chooses his own ending. The neighborhood, meanwhile, began its own process of forgetting. Sam still grumbled about the unkempt lawn, but he eventually started mowing Joe's edges out of a sense of public duty. The mailbox was emptied by the post office, marked as vacant. The dark sedan never reappeared. The mystery of the missing man faded into local folklore, the kind of story that gets brought up at bridge games and town meetings. Remember that quiet fellow who just vanished? The stories they told were fantastical, involving witness protection and winning the lottery. Ella smiled and kept her silence. She knew the truth was far quieter, far more human. It was about a man who needed to fix something deep inside and chose anonymity as the price. 2 months later, the yellow house was sold. A young couple, Beth and Mark, moved in. They were noisy, lively, and immediately started painting the house a startling shade of robin's egg blue. They had no silent routines. They played loud music, left their porch light on all night, and had different things for breakfast every morning, sometimes standing up. Ella found herself relieved. The stage was gone, the curtain pulled, and the story officially over. She no longer had a character to watch, but she had a notebook full of her own intentions. The robin's egg blue house was the opposite of Joe's silent yellow one, and the contrast made her own life feel refreshingly unburdened by the weight of a stranger's perfection. But the light. Beth and Mark found the honey-colored lamp, still plugged in and glowing. Confused, they unplugged it, putting it in a box with other items they planned to donate. However, the first night after they unplugged it, their house felt cold and strange. The second night, they plugged it back in, placing it in the window. They didn't know why, but the soft, golden glow felt right, felt comforting. A small act of warmth against the overwhelming darkness of a new place. Ella noticed the light immediately. She saw the familiar, honey-colored glow return to the living room window, a ghost of Joe's former habit. It was different now. It wasn't a rigid rule. It was just a lamp, placed there by instinct by a young couple who felt a need for quiet comfort. It was a beautiful, accidental continuation of the vigil, a signal passed on without words. She realized that Joe's routine wasn't about control. It was about presence. He ate breakfast to confirm he was there. He left the light on to confirm he existed in the darkness. She finished her first long entry in her notebook that morning, a reflective piece on the nature of habit and the terror of change. She had decided to book a train ticket, not to the coast, but across the country, a place she'd always wanted to see, just for a week. A sudden, terrifying, wholly unstructured trip. She was breaking her own cage. Her heart was pounding, but it wasn't the panic of a watcher. It was the excitement of a participant. Ella stepped out onto her porch, the first time in months she felt truly settled. She looked across the street at the robin's egg blue house, the honey-colored lamp glowing faintly in the morning sun. The 2-year ritual was over, but the silent, subconscious lesson remained. The quiet lives we lead are often seen by others, and sometimes the best way to live is to recognize the power of your own stage, even if you are the only one sitting in the audience. She knew then that she had to do one final thing. She walked across the street, carrying the small, heavy key tied with the red yarn. Beth, the new owner, was on the porch, trying to coax a stubborn vine off the railing. "Ma'am," Beth asked, smiling nervously. Ella held out the key. "This is for your back door," Ella said. "It belonged to the man who lived here before. He wanted the person who found it to have it. It's important." Beth took the key, the red yarn striking against her bright, young hand. "The back door works fine," Beth said, confused. "What's important about it?" Ella looked at the key, then at the bright blue house, then at her own window. "It's a reminder," Ella explained softly, the true Southern folktale tones settling into her voice, "that some people eat their oatmeal for 6 minutes and 42 seconds not because they like oatmeal, but because they're practicing for the moment they have to disappear. It means their heart is still here, even if the body had to go on a long, hard journey." Beth stared at the key, then back at Ella, her expression a mix of curiosity and mild alarm. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling behind them. She simply nodded. Ella turned and walked back across the street, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had passed on the key, but she had kept the story. The mystery was gone, replaced by a profound understanding. Joe had watched her watching him, and in his disappearance, he had gifted her the courage to live a life worth being watched. The window was now just a window, and Ella was finally ready to look out and see the wider world, not just the man who used to eat his breakfast alone.